growing just a little bit still, so we'll just take a moment or two to see if we get a few more attendees joining as we sort of go into this opening sequence. But welcome to the session. We have an hour thinking about successful remote interviewing and a little bit of time either side of that to get ourselves going and deal with questions and answers afterwards. So it's a real pleasure to spend this time with you. My name is Bob Bannister, and I'm from an independent organisation called I Manage Performance Limited, who specialise in helping people to develop their skills on and offline in terms of behaviour and being effective in what they do. So I've been invited along today, which is a real privilege by the AOP to run this session, but I'm going to hand over to Christian Dellers to start with, who will give us a little bit of an introduction and a few words really from our host. I'm going to change the slides over so you can see this one.
Fantastic. So thank you very much, Bob. Welcome, everybody. So I'm Christian Dellers. I'm a professor at the University of Glasgow. Real pleasure to have you here with us. I will not waste your time on any slides and long introductions, but just wanted to take the opportunity to give you a quick overview of the Association of Physicians, just in case you haven't heard of it. You should actually, because it's 112 years old. It has been founded by William Osler at that time. And it is a very prestigious association, obviously, but what has changed over the last few months and probably a couple of years is that we're now for the first time really open to a much wider public, so everybody can join us now and everybody can participate in our activities such as this webinar today. And everybody means really at any time of their career, whether you are a basic scientist, whether you are a clinician, feel free to join us and feel free to join our meeting. And you've got this on this slide here. So we will have a meeting in Oxford in 2021. And Bob, maybe you can show the next slide briefly, because it's an exciting program. We have a number of really hot topics we would like to discuss, from infectious diseases to big data. And I'm sure there's something that is interesting for all of us. And you see our website, aopgbi.org. And probably it's just worth to spend a few minutes there and see what else we have to offer. Well, can you show me the third slide, because that gives you another opportunity here. You can really submit abstracts and join us at the meeting actively. So here are the deadlines. You will also find them on the website. And if this all doesn't convince you, there's a fourth slide. Bob, if you show this, and that really shows what kind of prestigious speakers we will have in Oxford in 2021. So I'm sure there's something of interest to you. But to make this very, very clear, we have changed our focus in the last few months and a couple of years, so that we're really into training and career development of VCRs. So we want to provide you with the best possible experience, bring really good speakers, leaders in their field here, but our purpose is doing translational medicine and develop careers. And this is why we host this webinar today, because we know that many of us will be affected by the COVID situation. Now, I'm very sorry. I see just a note that the microphone here is not particularly good, so you will be pleased to hear that I will shut up anyway in a few minutes. So one thing I just need to do is to introduce our panel. So it will be myself. Bob has said a few words already, and I'm sure he will expand on this a little bit. And then we've got Rachel Miles also on board. Rachel is a consultant cardiologist and senior lecturer at the University of Glasgow. She's an electrophysiologist, and most importantly, she is a Wellcome Fellow. So she knows very much how it is to be on the receiving end, basically, of an interview panel. And certainly the situation is very different now with remote interviewing, whether it's for these fellowships, whether it's for faculty positions, whether it's for senior lecturer or clinical lecturer positions, whether it's remote PhD viva. I think that's what we learned today from Bob. So thank you very much for this. And now really the pressure is on Bob to entertain us in the next years.
There's no singing or dancing, though, I can promise you, during the course of the next hour. So thank you, guys. I'll come back to Rachel at the end. We'll deal with questions and work through the content. We've got quite a full hour ahead, guys. I will be working at quite a pace to cover the content that we're going to be looking at. So please make notes. Hopefully you've had a soft copy of the slides, the workbook as it were, that I'll be referring to and have on the screen throughout the duration of this. So please annotate that, make use of it, make it a resource that you can come back to after this session to help you when you are preparing for those remote interviews. But just to give you a little bit of an overview of where we're going in this next hour. Obviously, we're doing the opening sequence right now, but then we're going to really look at how we prepare and think about how we get the best out of the preparation, particular things that we need to focus on. And we're going to look at a particular phenomenon known as recency and primacy. It comes from neuro-linguistic programming. It's a psychological observation about the importance of interfacing with other humans, and it really has relevance in this scenario where we need to have an impact when we are being interviewed. So I want to help you think that through. We've got a little bit of an experiment we'll run when we do that. I'll point that out and explain that at the time. Then we're going to look really through techniques, so making the most of those first impressions. We're going to be thinking about listening beyond facts and data, so that we might be able to answer more intelligently and in a better way. We will then look at answering questions. We're going to think about particularly this idea of avoiding trait type answers and looking for experience behavioral based answering. So this little STAR model that's referred to here in the agenda, I'll overview for you. And then where experience is not evident, often questioners, interviewers will go to strengths-based questioning. So we'll look at how that's different. There's two types of questioning: behavioral-based questioning and strengths-based questioning. How do you get yourself ready for that? Now, many of you, you would be expected to give a short presentation, maybe 5 minutes, 10 minutes maximum possibly, during the course of a remote interview. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time as well focusing on some specific technique around presenting online, some things that can be really helpful to do and not do as well as you have that opportunity. So that's that whole section there. And then to finish off with, we'll be looking at the sort of the closing sequence. Well, what is the typical sequence of an interview, particularly the closing sequence? How do I maximize that as we come into the end? And again, coming back to my own questions that I'll be asking of the interview panel in the organization. So all of this, by the way, has some interaction. So slido.com, you'll see this QR code on the screen right now. Slido.com is a vehicle for us to interact during the course of this session. Now you can, with your cameras on your phones, just point it at the QR code and that should take you out to slido.com. And then you'll need this code, this hashtag AOP642. If you key that in any new browser window on your phone, so I'm logged in on my phone, that would be really useful during the course of this session to get some interaction. It's 54 of you out there, and clearly we can't open cameras and microphones with that amount of people and with the time we've got. So please make use of slido.com. If you go to the Q&A section, you can at any point ask a question, and we will look to deal with that at the end if we haven't dealt with it before. So please feel free to pop questions in there. That will be open for the next week, by the way. So you can keep coming back to this for the next week and popping your questions in. We collectively, the team here, will keep an eye on that and seek to answer any questions during the course of the coming days. Now, you'll also notice there is a poll section. Now, that's not switched on at the moment, it's empty, but that's what I'm going to be using, the sort of experiment exercise that I'm going to introduce a little bit later on as we get into the content. So please feel free to do that. Go into slido.com. Be really nice to get some interaction going, given that it is a bit of a webinar style where it's much more one way. So please help me with that. Right, we're going to jump straight in. I've got 1 hour on the clock. We've got a lot to get through. So let's start to get our brains whirring and thinking about this. So what we've got here is the starting point. Now, some of this is obvious, and it would be obvious if it was a face-to-face interview. What I'm going to suggest is that in a remote interview, some of these things are even more important, because you don't get so many of the signals that you get when you walk into the building for a face-to-face interview. You know, you're picking up so much information and knowledge en route as you walk down the street, as you walk through the reception, and as you start to meet people. You're getting cultural cues, you're getting visuals on dress code and all sorts of unique things about that organization that all inform you and all help you. Now, in a remote world, we lose a big piece of that. So we need to inject back in more robustness in our preparation and in the way we get ready for the interview. So there are a number of things that I've got here as sort of headlines, really, of things that we should be thinking about, particularly you know, about the organization. Have you really researched them? Have you understood them? Have you got into some of the main voices of that organization? Have you tapped into, you know, research that's going on or professors that are publishing? Have you got a feel for that organization? You know, in many situations, I actually encourage people to get onto Google Street View, you know, just to look around the building, to get just a different perspective on it. And you know, you can size up lots of organizations by the way they look. Can you pore over the website? What are the visuals like? What's the character and style of the organization? So really important to do that piece. But beyond that as well, it's equally and obviously important. I can just grab a marker pen here just to highlight as we're going. So, you know, the role and the opportunity. We've got to research that. We've got to get on top of it and maybe do a bit of extra legwork about who can give me some insight into this. Who do I know in my network? Who have I, you know, studied with? Who do I respect? Who do I know in the field that actually might be able to give me a little more clarity about that role? So I come to this interview pre-armed, pre-warned, with already some ideas about what I might expect in that role. Now, this is an interesting thought. Can I research the interview panel? Can I find out who will be taking part in that interview? Maybe somebody like Rachel will be there, part of the interview panel. Can I get on LinkedIn and find out a little bit about Rachel or whoever it might be, so that I, again, am familiar with them? What have they published? What, you know, what is out there that I can learn about these individuals? Again, if I do this ahead of the interview, I start to inform my answers and my thinking in a much more powerful way. Now, we're going to come back to this one, but clearly we need to think about questions. And this is really important, not only about questions that I might be asked, but questions I'm going to ask. So the next slide, I'm going to come back to that one specifically. But this last idea, you know, particularly important if it's a fellowship interview, is to think through, you know, where does the funding come from? What does what the funding body normally funds, and you know, can I tap into their preferences and desires and goals and values, etc. So for fellowship interviews, it would be really helpful to get a handle on that. And you know, those shortlisted for the interview anyway are probably already those that have done their homework and submitted competitive applications for that funding. So, you know, in that process, I ought to be starting my understanding of the organisation and their preferences. And I think it's really important when we talk about the questioning generally, that we become quite specific in the way that we are answering, or beg your pardon, in the way that we are asking questions. So we really don't want to be vague and make statements that you know, aren't particularly insightful. What would be much better in job interviews for, say, clinical lecture posts or PhD positions, is to really show that we've done our research by answering really insightful questions of stuff that's meaningful and isn't available. You know, kind of you've done your work and you know what information is available, and you're asking questions about stuff isn't readily available online. But also just articulating the fact that you have thought things through and done your homework. So for example, you might be really specific, like saying, I know that the Institute of Cardiovascular and Medical Sciences within the University of Glasgow is great, and particularly in areas of vascular biology and heart failure. I'm aware of the recent work by Professor XYZ, etc. Now, I had to read that because it's quite medical and I'm not a medical person, so forgive me for that. But you get my point. It's valuable to actually have done your work so that you go beyond just, I know the institute is fantastic. Well, yeah, great, but what's your evidence for saying that? And have you really done the work, or are you just offering up traits actually that are not very insightful about your capability and the work you've done? So let's just talk a little bit more about the questioning then. And in particular, I want to break this into the two parts of this. The fact that you will be asked questions, so I need to prepare for that. And also, you want to be ready to ask the interview panel your questions. And both these things need some attention and focus. Now, first of all, let's do with the questions you may be asked. You should be looking to anticipate these. Now, I put, with help from the colleagues here, I put a number of questions that we might consider are commonly asked when you turn up for an interview. They might be quite generic, maybe some of them a little bit here more specific about life sciences, etc. But we really should work out what questions are likely to be asked and work out how we would answer those. This is just a foundation block in getting this right, in being a successful candidate at the end of it, that we sort these things through. Now, I'm not going to read through these individually now this afternoon. You've got this document so that you can access that and have a look at some of these examples that we put in here. But it's also not just about anticipation, what question am I going to be asked? It's about preparation and planning. What questions do I need to ask, or could I ask in this interview? And I go back to actually, if there's no point in asking questions just for question's sake. You don't want just to feel I've got to ask a question. What really matters in an interview scenario is that you're asking penetrating questions that actually you need, or the answer isn't readily available for. So we put again a few examples here of the types of things that we might expect or might consider as potential questions. How's the organisation handling challenges such as budgeting or constraints with COVID-19 or whatever. But we really want a library, if you like, a menu of these questions. We may not use them all. It depends on where the dialogue goes and how the interview goes. But actually, if I've done my homework and I've got a good menu of questions, that will serve me well as I go into the interview itself. Now, as I said, we are moving at a pace, so forgive me for that. But do feel free to ask questions on the Q&A in Slido. Just remind you of that. There's no questions emerged just yet, but do make use of that as we work through. Now, I want to highlight for you a phenomenon called recency and primacy that has to do with the importance of different aspects of the interview. Now, I've got an empty page here, but what I'm going to do is have a bit of fun with you and ask you actually to memorize 15 words. Now, I can't see what you're doing. You could really cheat here because you could write them all down because I can't see you. But what I'm going to ask you to do for experimental purposes and to see what happens, come with me on the journey, just try to remember the 15 words I'm about to read out. Now, once I've finished, I will allow you to note them, okay? Write them down. Write down as many as you can remember. And then very quickly using Slido, I'm going to get to you to show me what words you've remembered. Not a quiz, it's not about winning all 15 words. It's about the psychology associated with this. So for a start, I have my list of 15 words here. Okay, I'm going to read these 15 words out. I will not repeat them. Once I start, I will read all 15. You must commit them to memory. I'm relying on you doing that and not writing them down. When I finish, I'll allow you to write as many down as you can remember. They don't have to be in order. They can be just as they come to mind. So that's the exercise. Let's read through these 15 words. I'm starting now. Cow, helicopter, meeting, voice, tree, ball, coat, fish, chair, foot, bike, house, police, hat, river. Okay, write down as many of those words as you can remember. I'll give you a couple of moments. Okay, it's probably long enough. You can carry on writing if you can remember any more, but that's more or less it, I think. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring in Slido here and switch on a poll, okay? And I'm going to make this full screen, I think, so that you can all see the results. What I'm going to ask you to do in Slido is to go in and you'll now see these words listed, okay? What I'm going to ask you to do is just tick all of those that you wrote down, okay? They don't have to be in order, but if you wrote them down, I'd like you to add them to this list. And when you've done that, all of them, just send it to complete the exercise. So 6 of you have done that already, 7 as we go. So this is very helpful. We've got 63 people in the room, so we'll see how close we get to 63 responses to this. Okay, we're slowing up a bit now. Any more to come in? Any more of you done it? Yep, some coming, 38. Okay, we're starting to slow down now. 44 entrants in. If you've got still some to enter, please do that. And I'm going to just duck out of here. I will come back to this in a second. But I just want to perhaps draw something that might help us understand what we've just done. And then I'll come back to those results. So recency and primacy argues that we have real impact on the primacy, the first things we say, and recency, which is the last thing we say. So a perfect recency primacy curve, often in this example we've just done, starts with the highest retention. It will dip out in the middle and then it will recover at the end, but often not recover quite so strongly as it started. So if we just look at our results that we had here in, where's it gone? Here it is. What do we find? The first 2 words have very high retention. They are the highest retention. 41 out of 44 of us that responded remembered those words. We then see some lower level activity, maybe bike looks like our lowest word, somewhere towards the middle, but in that middle section. And then we have some good recovery at the end again, 28, 31, 29, 35. So what we're seeing here is a lovely example, we just 44 respondents on 15 words of a recency and primacy effect. The first things have the greatest impact, primacy, and the next thing to have the greatest impact is the closing sequence of any interaction. Now, let's start to think about how that applies, if we're talking about how we approach a remote interview. Well, there's a simple thing here, isn't there? That actually, I bet most of us put all our prep into the middle. If we talk about the the middle of an interview, we're ready for that, we prep for it, we think how that's going to go. Now, I'm not saying don't do that, hear me correctly, that is super important, we must prep for the middle. But we are missing a major trick if we overlook the impact we have in the opening sequence, a major miss if we don't recognize just how powerful it is to give the right impressions, to be saying the right things in the opening sequence. And equally, we're missing a trick if we don't recognize the opportunity to capitalize on the closing sequence of that interview. So that really means we need to prep the ends, if you like, the beginning and the end, the bookends, just as strongly, if not even more strongly than we prep the middle. Because it's the thing that often we don't give much attention. You know, we kind of ease ourselves into an interview rather than thinking about, you know, really, how do I want to be perceived in that opening sequence? How do I want to come across? What things do I want to be saying? How do I want to look? How do my appearance impact perception around about me? And so, and then closing sequence, what do I want to leave in people's mind? This is like the sticky residue in the bottom of a coffee cup. You know, they've drunk the coffee, what's left? And what of you is left with them? Can I leave some really good sticky messaging that, you know, sticks with the panel as you exit and sign off the Zoom call or whatever it happens to be? So recency and primacy is really important. And I'm just going to build on that then by talking about these first impressions. First impressions are there. Now, you know, we recognize problems in bias, but we also have to recognize that we do form impressions very quickly, and we make impressions very quickly on people. The University of California was saying that we make impressions in milliseconds now, rather than even, you know, just a few seconds or the first few minutes. They're saying it's, you know, super quickly we're making an impression. And the interesting thing here for us, isn't it, that you know, in a traditional face-to-face interview, is that you would walk up to somebody, you'd shake their hand, you'd look them in the eye and kind of have a conversation with them. And now we can't do that. Now we've got this remote interview scenario. I need to work out how actually I have that same interface, but in a very different way, without the physicality of it. And so, you know, it's some important things here that are just useful for us to consider. You know, practicing the opening sequence. I can't really stress how important I think that is. It's the opening and closing sequence that often go wrong for people because they have not practiced it. They haven't thought that through. Think about how you're going to introduce yourself, what you're going to say about yourself, and rehearse it. By the way, mirrors are good for rehearsing remote interviews, because you are, in fact, like I am now, seeing myself here in the screen, and that's not too dissimilar to a mirror. So, you know, kind of practice it, rehearse it, know what you're going to be saying. That helps you to deal with what Professor Steve Peters in The Chimp Paradox, great book, by the way, if you haven't come across that, on thinking about how our brains work. But he argues, you know, our emotional brain takes over in so many pressured situations, just like in interviews. He argues it's 5 times faster. He calls it the chimp brain. It's the Chimp Paradox, the book. He argues that works 5 times faster biologically than the facts and data side of our brain, which he calls our human. So that's his metaphor. And we have to practice this to the level that we're managing that emotion and feeling that will exist in the opening sequence. Our heart may be pumping. We need to slow it down and think about, you know, the recency and primacy model. How do I appear calm and collected, more elephant-like? I'm thinking calm elephant, okay, you know, presence, slower movement, etc., than mouse-like, that is scurrying and sort of jerky and nervous and squeaky. So yeah, practice that opening sequence. Consider what you're going to wear. I know this may sound like teaching grandmother to suck eggs, and I apologize for that. But we've all seen was it monster.com, the advert on TV, job recruitment company, and the guy's having an interview and the camera pans back, in a remote interview, comes back and he's got his shorts and these big furry slippers on. You know, I honestly think you should put your best shoes on to do a remote interview. You should dress up as though you were walking in the room. because it helps with your confidence. It helps with your own feeling of well-being in that moment. You know, don't have your PJs on under the table. It's just, it's not going to help you to really, you know, give the best of you in that moment. Simple things, but if the opening sequence is super important, you cannot mess about with punctuality. You know, you really need to think about, how am I allowing extra time? And can I just suggest, in a remote world, plenty of extra time, just to make sure all the tech's working, make sure that you're connected, make sure everything's working. You know, this is anecdotal, but the guys here with me were here at 12:30, a half an hour before this session started, just to make sure that everything was up and running. Now, you might not want to join something half an hour early, but you definitely want everything set up a half an hour early. And when you do connect, you want to be thinking 10 minutes, you know, minimum, I think, to get connected with with the system, make sure everything's working, and work your way around it. Now, clearly, positivity and enthusiasm are a pretty massive thing in communicating energy, engagement, passion with people. Now, I already said, be more elephant-like, not stampeding elephant, but, you know, calm elephant-like in your movements, slow those down to look confident. But, you know, you still want energy in that. And certainly by the time you move into that presentation phase, maybe, you really want the energy level to have come up. And you can be a bit faster at that point, because that energy might say passion, excitement, interest, enthusiasm, all of those things. But that opening sequence, I'm going to slow it down. I'm going to be more calm and collected and show a confidence in that opening sequence rather than show passion. That can come later in that interview. Now, I'm going to come back to this in a model by a guy called Morabian. I've got a couple of slides time, but you know, be aware of what I call the lyrics, the song, the dance. There's the lyrics, the content of our language, the words that we are using. Then there is the musicality of it. Okay, that's the inflection, the volume, the intonation, the speed of the language. And then there is the dance, the physicality of it, the gesture, the posture, the movement, the expression. Now, in remote environments, very often people move back to content only. You know, we start operating with email and that type of thing. Now, video conference does allow us to open up that, so that we've got the tonal elements and the physical elements, the body language involved in that. And so I know this is a simple and maybe an obvious thing to state, but I'm going to state it anyway. We absolutely should be on camera. And there should be no question about that, even whether or not your panel is on camera, because sometimes they may be and sometimes they may not be. Sometimes they may start on camera and then switch it off at some particular point. And we kind of want to be ready for that. But I think you want to give 100% of you to an interview. And if I'm cutting down just to tone and content, then they're missing a massive part of the energy and the insight and the understanding that body language brings. Joe, even right now, guys, can I just say to you, I can see Rachel and Christian on the TV in front of me, and that is super helpful for me, because it doesn't feel like I'm here on my own. And it's the same the other way around. I'm reading little nods and gestures and sort of, you know, micro movements even, that's giving me comfort that I'm not messing this up dreadfully and it's all going okay. And so, you know, you want to give those signals as well, that they can see and hear those things. I'm going to come back to that in a moment with a bit of a study insight. Finally, just about these first impressions, really, I want to say be clear and concise. So don't go into waffle mode. Recognize when you said enough. And again, if you practice and prepare this opening sequence, that will really help you. But this is true right the way through the interview, really. You want to say what you need to say to answer a question concisely and effectively, and then stop. You know, it's very easy in the remote environment actually to overdo it, to start to waffle a little bit. Have they got it? Especially when you've not got cameras of the panel, maybe, or the interviewee. interviewers, because you're not getting the the visual cue that they're nodding and that they've got it. So I might carry on a little bit too long. So be concise, recognize that precision is valuable when we're doing a remote interview, and especially if I can't see the other people. They'll ask if they want to know more, so don't be frightened to stop it when you think you've covered it sufficiently, and allow them to do that. Now, the reverse, of course, of us talking is the fact that we really need to listen hard in an interview environment. I think this is often underdone. Here's a little trick and tip of mine for interviewees. Interviewers, put your fingers in your ears. You're not allowed to hear this, but many interviewers will give a lot away in their opening sequence. They will talk too much, in my opinion, and they'll really sell the organization and the opportunity and some of that kind of stuff. Now, we really should be listening hard to everything they've got to say, because it helps to fine tune and inform what it is we say in response to them. So there's a little bit of a sense of dear old Stephen Covey's book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. He talks about understanding before you're understood. You know, you guys are in the medical field. No one would like the doctor. If you walked into the doctor's surgery, you didn't say a word and the doctor just said, look, here's your prescription. You say, well, hold on, ask me a question, find out what's wrong with me. You know, if we understand before we're understood, then we have advantage of hindsight. We feel diagnosed as well, and the other person feel diagnosed, which helps them to take the medicine afterwards. But this is a super useful thing to really listen hard, especially in the opening part of the interview. What are they saying? How are they saying it? Now, here we go, these listening levels. I don't know if you've ever come across these. Normally, pretty well everyone listens most of the time at level 1. They're listening for facts and data. They're listening to the content, but it is almost like content without tone and body language. They're stripping out a lot of the insight if they just listen at facts level. It's actually pretty easy, and had I got time, I could demonstrate this to you. It's pretty easy to move that down to level 2 listening, which is about feelings and emotions. You can hear in somebody's tone of voice how they feel about what they're saying, whether they are positive towards it or they're negative against something. We need to listen to those signals and understand how a panel feels when they ask a particular question. Is there just a tone of voice in that gives me some inkling as to the way they think that question should be answered? And if we're clever and we practice this, and you can practice it, you can move down to level 3 listening with surprising accuracy. And level 3 is, what values and beliefs does this person have? What do they hold true? What are some of the things that are foundational to them? Now, in a longer workshop type environment, what I tend to do at this point is go into a 5-minute monologue. I know I'm doing a monologue now, it's a webinar, so forgive me for that. But you know, if I tell you a little story and ask you to listen for feelings, emotions, and values and beliefs, and when I do that, I can tell you time after time after time, people will play back to me exactly how I feel about this topic and exactly what my values and beliefs are, even though I have not overtly mentioned any of my feelings, beliefs, feelings, emotions, values, and beliefs. So it is super useful to do. It's very easy to tap into listening at this level. And we should really practice this all the time, not just for interviews. But, you know, how is this question being asked? What are they saying? What are some of the cues I'm getting that helps me to get into the culture of this organization that will just give me that slight advantage of foresight so that I can respond to what they've said in a way that hits the spot and resonates with them. So listening, you know, we really need to work hard at that as we go into the interview, especially, you know, as we recognize that sometimes we have problems with audio on remote remote vehicles. The internet might be struggling at that particular moment. It always does when you don't want it to. And you know, you've really got to tune into what are they saying. Camera helps us with that as well. because we can tune into some of the lip reading type stuff as well that helps us. So what's the time? We're okay. We've got quite a lot to get through. So let's move on to questioning. And I want you to think about how you're answering questions at this point. Now, a common fault in interview scenarios is people start sort of answering questions in this sort of traits, labels, stereotypes type way. They might say, yes, I'm really reliable. Now, of course, that tells me nothing about you, only your opinion. It doesn't give me any depth of confidence that you are actually reliable. It just tells me that you're good at saying you're reliable. What would be much better in that scenario is if I were to give some evidence of when I'm reliable. If I could sort of express a behavior, what have I said and done in recent days that have demonstrated that I'm reliable? So this is where we want to drive a lot of our answers to this sort of behavioral based answer. So an example of I'm reliable might actually go like this. I have met all my project deadlines on the XYZ project. So I'm giving a tangible example. Now, of course, you could be blagging that. You could fluff that if you were good at acting. But actually, the reality is, it's another step of information and evidence that is supporting this idea that I might be reliable in any particular situation. Now, we can strengthen this, actually. We can make our answers really start to show stronger evidence that we are reliable, or whatever it might be, by using this STAR model. So a little acronym, super simple to remember, which is always best, helps me anyway when they're simple to remember. STAR, situation, task, action, result. Now, this is a great way to answer pretty well any question that you get asked. So you talk about the situation, you quickly move into the task that you were involved in doing. So you've just narrowed, you've gone big picture, smaller picture. Then you go specific. This was the action that I carried out. And then you confirm that by this was the result that I undertook. Now, if I answer questions in that helpful way, I'm providing some real confidence that I have actually done those things. Because it's difficult to wing this. It's difficult to come up with these on the spur of the moment. You need to have these examples in your mind, and you need, maybe as you're answering your question, just to pause for a moment while you think about your answer, situation, task, action, result, prep that for just a few seconds in your head before you launch in and open your mouth. By the way, that's never a problem. It's not a problem because somebody, quiet for a few seconds, and usually it's only a few seconds while they think about it, says they're thinking, they're working that out, and it doesn't send a bad signal. It sends a good signal, in my book, that they're not just winging it, they're actually thinking about their answer. And can I also say, in remote interviews, it plays to your advantage that there's often time lag. And so if there's a slightly longer pause where you just think about your answers, it's not so odd. It's quite common for there to be that sort of slight delay. So maybe it's disguised a little bit more in remote working, I don't know. Now, let me give you an example of this STAR model. I popped an example down the bottom here. I'll just highlight that for you. So you might say, okay, so situation. Well, for example, last week I had 4 deadlines in 3 days. So that's the situation part. It's a sentence. It's short. It doesn't need to be long. The task piece then. I had to prioritize my time very well to make sure I submitted all 4 reports on time. And now the action, okay? So I looked at both the deadline and the time each report would take, and I decided the order in which I'd approach them. And then the result. In the end, I was really pleased that I pushed through this challenge and submitted everything on time with a comfortable buffer. Now, all I've done is followed that model, situation, task, action, result. And I've given a really concrete example here of how I prioritize my work. So, you know, I didn't say this, but the question at the top, imagine you were asked, how do you prioritize your work? Okay, let's find an example. The situation, task, action, had this result, bingo. It's a really nice, strong way of concisely still dealing with that question. Now, a good interviewer would have in mind that there might be some of these sort of what I call false stars. So as an interviewee, you need to beware of false stars. So they might be vague statements where you start to get a little bit fluffy about how you prioritize stuff. So that sends the alarm bells. But actually, if you move to opinion, you know, how do you prioritize your work? Well, in my opinion, it's good to prioritize your work by doing X, Y, Z. That's not evidence. It's your opinion. That's something. It's giving the interviewer a piece of information about you, but it's not behavioral. It's not evidence that you've done that. It's evidence that this is what you think you would do. And again, theoretical answers, you know, well, in theory, if I was to do that, I would. It's a piece of information. It's what you might do in that situation, but again, it's not evidence that you have that skill and have you done that in the past. If you do the STAR model, that's helping to demonstrate that you have done that. And so anything that's sort of future orientated then starts to reduce the power of the answer, because it's what you might do, would do, could do. It's how you might think about something as opposed to what you've actually done and evidence that you have that experience. Now, look, if you haven't got the experience, I accept that sometimes you've got to move to, you know, in theory, I might do this. But wherever you have got the evidence, use it, show it, articulate that so that people know that you are somebody who's been there, done it. Now, sometimes when somebody doesn't have the experience, what interviewers tend to do is move more to strength-based techniques, strength-based questioning techniques. So this, in a sense, is looking for areas of your life where you might have a capability that would be complementary for this particular activity, role, opportunity. So I put down here some maybe typical strength-based questions that, you know, might be worth thinking about preparing and being ready for this type of thing. And in fact, dialogue with the guys before this session, maybe there's a few of these that are really common. So out of my list here, I'm going to suggest number 2. Tell me about something you're particularly proud of is quite a common one. Number 4, what would you say is your biggest weakness? Can quite often be asked. Number 6, tell me about an activity or task that comes easily to you. Number 8, what unique qualities could you bring to the organization? So 2, 4, 6, 8, those questions, definitely prep those. Know how you'd answer those. Maybe think about some of these others as well. Think about where you do stuff that might have complementary skills. Well, you might be involved in something, a club or an activity or an interest that actually, you know, some of those skills are transferable into this particular opportunity. So have those ready and have them in mind, because if an interviewee can't get evidence of historic behavior, then they may well move to this sort of strength-based questioning technique. So preparing these beforehand, always useful to think this through and to do that. Now, what if we move to the presentation piece then? So for many of you in this type of environment, you're having to present 5 minutes or so to the panel. And what might be some useful input into that, particularly as you're presenting online and having to cope with, you know, kind of showing slides and, you know, maybe your camera as well and managing all of that. Well, here's my first guide. If you're presenting online, I would suggest you only need a slide if it is doing one of these 3 E's. Emphasizing something, maybe entertaining, be careful with that one, or explaining. There are 3 good reasons to have a slide. Otherwise, I'm going to suggest to you, you want to be the presentation, not the slide deck. You want to be the one that's engaging the audience and having your slides support you rather than the slides being the presentation and you supporting them. If you have only put on your slides all your script, that will come over dull. There is no two questions about it. It will be like, I'm just having this read to me. You could PDF this to me and I could read it myself. What we need is the skeleton in our slide deck, and we need to be the ones that bring that to life. Now, you know, that might mean we need notes. So here, you look, I can show you pages where, you know, I've got exactly this. So I've got the slide, but all those notes at the bottom are my notes that nobody else has got. But that helps me to talk about that content and build on the content on the slide rather than just merely read out that slide. And we should do exactly the same, I think. You want a hard copy with your notes on. I really like handwritten notes as well, actually, because there's something about the pen and your connection with something you've written that is a bit more personal and easier to access in my book compared to just text notes. So I do both. If there's a lot of text, then I'll pop it on here, but you know, I'll put little reminders to myself and write those on a hard copy, just printed out here. Emphasize, explain good reasons for those slides, as we've said. Now, a couple of other ideas here. I think visuals really need to add to the presentation, not distract from it. And you know, it's really important, I think, to minimize the amount of slide builds and animation that you put in here. Now, if I was doing a big presentation to 100 people in an auditorium type scenario, I would probably put that stuff in, some of the movement and the changes, etc. When I'm remote presenting, a lot of that subtlety disappears. You know, the slides don't move so quickly. You know, you're not getting the same frame rate as you would if you were projecting it, etc. So I really recommend you to do one click, one slide as much as possible. I don't even like reveals. I think it's often messy because people, you know, they'll often go, oh, and then press all 3 reveals and then kind of go backwards and get in a bit of a muddle with it. I think if you one click, one slide, get that content up, deal with that, then move on to the next slide. So keep it simple. Don't think you're being clever by putting lots of fades and whizzy text, etc. around, especially when remote working, remote interviewing. Clearly use a good size font. Okay, so I recommend, and I try and always use at least 18-point font, and I try and keep to a 6x6 rule, so that is no more than 6 bullet points and 6 words. I think that's absolutely top end. I prefer it less than that, but that's a nice little rule that might be useful for people. And then, you know, again, you know, keep a font that is not too ornamental, difficult to read, but is nice and plain and clear. And remember recency and primacy too. You know, as you go into that presentation, you've got another sort of impactful moment. How am I going to capitalize on the opening sequence of that presentation? And how am I going to capitalize on the closing sequence? I see so many people do presentations like this. If you imagine an aircraft taking off, you know, they get the presentation off the ground, they fly along, and then they just drop out of the sky at the end. It often kind of goes like this. Their kind of face goes a bit white, and you go, okay, they've run out, and they go, any questions? And they kind of just drop out of the sky. We're losing that huge opportunity to do a really neat landing and capitalize on the primacy effect and really nail what it is that we are trying to say. I rather like, it might not work for you, but I rather like the idea of tell them what you're going to tell them what you told them. So some repetition in that opening sequence, tell them what you're going to tell them in the middle, and then tell them what you told them as a closing sequence, obviously focusing on the key aspects as you go in and out of that presentation. So really think about that simplicity, making that really effective. And then have a think about this as well. What I'm doing here is I just opened this up. You can see I'm actually using a PDF. Now I created this as a slide deck, but I'm using a PDF to present here. And I'm doing that because it's very easy for me to choose a marker pen and highlight stuff as I'm going. It's also very easy for me to pick up a text box. If at some point I might, if I was doing something, I might type some text in here. It gives me more opportunity. I'd need to practice this, by the way. You'd need to make sure that you're able to do it and it works well for you. But kind of a PDF is perhaps a useful way of taking some of the complexity out and allowing you to do a little bit more, something around maybe a marker pen or something, just to bring it to life with your audience. The problem with PowerPoint is that when you go into present mode, it often does funny things in terms of dual screens and where's my people, where can I see the cameras, etc., etc. So I really like the idea of a PDF, just using that as a straightforward, simple idea. Now, with all of this, I'm going to actually introduce this Morabian study that I mentioned earlier. So lyrics on the dance. So Morabian, what he suggested was that in the way we understand the messaging, content, the lyrics, as only 7% of the way in which we interpret the message. The tonal element and the body language is a great deal, tone of 38%, body language, a great big 55% of the message. So when we start to think about our slides again, we're really only talking about this little piece. That's the content. What makes a presentation come to life is the way in which you deliver it, the way in which you animate it with your body language and your gesture and your posture. Now, Morabian is not saying the content can be wrong. That would be to misunderstand this study. What he's saying here is the way we interpret the content is massively influenced by the way it's delivered, the tone and the body language. So a silly example, but I might go home sometimes, go in the front door and go, "Hi Sal, I'm home, how are you?" And she says, "I'm fine." And I know she's not fine in that moment. I don't need any body language lessons or any, other insight than she's not fine. Content says she was, but the tone and the body language absolutely tells me something's wrong. So that's Morabian's point. The way we deliver something massively informs the way it's received and understood. Now, I say again, the content must be right. This is not saying the content can be wrong, but we really need to think about how we're coming across in delivering this presentation. If it's all slides, if it's all content, and all I am is reading off that, then you've got a fairly dry 5-10 minute presentation. But actually, if my 3 E's come into play, my slides only emphasize, explain, or entertain, and I'm doing the delivery in terms of the tonal elements and the body language elements, the posture, gesture, expression, etc., then that's much more powerful, so much more powerful. You're seeing me now, on camera, as well as this screen, and you're seeing me in terms of my expression, my movement. I kind of like the idea when I'm in a remote world of thinking table tennis, actually. If I was on a big stage, I might think tennis, I want big movements. But actually in a environment like this, a remote environment, I do want to be thinking, am I using my arms and my hands to express what I'm doing? And another, if you can do this, another really valuable idea is actually getting the camera away from you. So you can see my camera is actually not the camera on my laptop. I've got plugged into a camera in front of me here, which gives a very different perspective on me. And I think a better one. And, is it worth investing 20 quid in an external camera for an interview? I would, think about, okay, how can I actually create an environment where I come across looking so much more professional just because my camera isn't looking at my nose, and my hands look very big and my gesture seems strange because of that. So yeah, consider that. What's the layout of your room? Have you got a second screen you could use? That, like I've got the images, cameras here, and my content here. super useful thing to do to work the tonal elements and the body language elements as you go through your interview. Now, where am I? I've got a few slides here to go. I think we're okay. I've got a few more minutes because we didn't get to me until a little bit past 1 o'clock, so I can go a few minutes more, I'm sure. Now, consider this presenting online. It may seem strange if your audience disappear. Really does. Rachel and I were talking about this before we started the session. It's the oddest thing when you cannot see your audience, but be prepared for it. Because when you go into presentation mode, they may switch their cameras off, or depending on the tool you're using, some will only show the slides and not the cameras and the slides, etc. So be ready for that potential that you are presenting to a mirror. You're just presenting to yourself. It's hard because you're not reading the body language, the cues of whether people have got something or not. But be ready and expect it, and then it won't necessarily take you by surprise. Again, if you're well rehearsed, that helps you get over that. Be ready for latency as well, the lag between connections. Sometimes it can be a lot, sometimes it's not too bad. But again, you know, just recognize it can be a bit off-putting because you get that thing where two panelists start talking at the same time, etc. Now, just allow that space, relax about it, allow the microsecond pauses just to check, okay, is nobody saying anything, and be ready for that lag. Clarity, brevity, virtues. We said this already. Be precise, concise, don't overstep the mark in terms of content. If you are given, I'm a bit of a stickler for this, I have to confess, but if you are given a 5-minute slot to do your presentation, it absolutely should be 5 minutes, not 4 minutes, not 6 minutes, definitely not 2 minutes or 8 minutes. But you should absolutely plan for that to be 5 minutes long. And you can do that, but it takes rehearsal. You have to work it down. You have to think about how you're going to cover it, and you have to time yourself and practice. But it is absolutely such a strong suit if you can do it. If, you know, the previous interviewee is overrun, or the other one, you know, kind of got it over and done in 3 minutes, and you know, you're precise with that because you've rehearsed it. I like that. I think that bodes well and says that you put that effort in, and also, you know, kept to within the parameters that are required. Now, I don't know what you think about this one, but I would recommend, if at all possible, you find out what platform this remote interview is going to be hosted on. Is it Zoom, GoToMeeting, Skype, MS Teams? You know, ask the question before the interview, and if you are able to find out, download it, play with it, learn that system before the interview, understand it, you know where the buttons are for each of them, know how you show your slides and where you switch your slides on, share your screen, etc. Practice it, get your mates or spouses or partners or whatever on the other end of it, and rehearse how you switch your slides on and show that all professionally. Because if there's one thing that let you down and make you look silly, it's often the tech, I always think. So, you know, get that taped, find out what system it is if you can, and have a practice with that system, understand it. Try and use PDFs, mentioned that. Again, practice it, see if you like it, see if that works for you. Now, here's a thought. As far as possible, iron out any technical difficulties. If you don't rehearse the technical piece, you may find that, you know, the bedroom that you're going to be using or something isn't such a strong signal as when you were downstairs in the kitchen to your Wi-Fi. And these things become really important. It's really so unhelpful if some of the technology starts letting you down and detracts from your potential as a candidate in this situation. So I really think that you want to you know, make this stuff as concrete as possible. Think about the obvious things. Am I near the router? Have I got everything sorted out and connected in a useful way? Is it all up and running before the session? Don't get caught out by having to reboot your laptop 2 minutes before the interview starts. Get that stuff ready and taped. And I know I've said it lots, but this is a big tick for me. Rehearse, rehearse, rehearse. Run through that presentation. Get super used to it, know it inside out. Now let's go into a bit of sort of closing sequence and questioning, and spend just a few minutes here. Am I okay for time, guys? I can run a few more minutes. Is that okay? The team, yeah. Thank you. So remember recency and primacy. Your closing sequence is really as important as your opening sequence. And I would recommend that you write down 3 completely different versions of why you would be a great candidate. Now, you might not even use these, but I believe that the practice of doing that will be useful to you during the course of the interview. But be ready to put a strong ending in, to be able to summarize stuff, to be able to say why you might be able to contribute in a really effective way. And if you put 3 different versions down before, you've kind of got a menu again that you might choose from, because something might emerge as being more appropriate or helpful during the course of the interview. And now you've got a choice that you can pull from. So I really like that, sort of having a thought about, if I get the opportunity and it's not not inappropriate, to sort of have a sort of a final summary word, what would I say to this panel? Give yourself 3 versions. A great way to do that. I like to use the words, or recommend people use these words to start it. I believe I would be a good candidate because. Write that down 3 times. I believe I would be a good candidate because. And give yourself that ammunition that you might use and might not use, but it's there and it could be helpful during the interview. And then I think it is really important to look for those insightful questions, so that when you get an opportunity, a panel will often say, have you got any questions? That you're not just asking questions for the question's sake, but you've identified stuff that isn't evident or obvious, and would be good to find out, so that you can demonstrate again, that you're being clever with your questioning. You're not just wasting that opportunity. And I've put maybe some examples here, but you need to think about that. And I would say, write 4 or 5 questions down for that opportunity if you get asked. But make them genuine questions. And if there aren't genuine questions, just accept that and be prepared to say, look, guys, you've answered really effectively the questions that I had, and I don't think I've got anything more to ask at this point in time. We don't need to try and bluff our way through that. But have we got some real great questions that you haven't answered? Then fantastic. That's a really good place to be. So work that through. Look for the stuff that's not clear, and base your questions around that to take to the interview. Now, what have I got? I've got sort of my closing slide here, really, apart from a learning log, which I'll just get you to think about in a moment, is how I might expect the interview to be structured. Really simply, interviews often have this sort of warm-up phase, the information exchange phase, and a wrap-up phase. Now, I'm not going to sit here and read this out. You've got these notes here. You can look at this at your leisure and think this through. But again, it's very useful to be thinking, how is this going to unfold, this interview? How am I ready at each of these points to do what I need to do? And so often it's the wrap up where you get the panel saying, do you have any questions, anything that you would particularly like to ask at this point? So that would be the common thing. And again, I say, don't be afraid at this point to say, no, actually, you've answered the questions that I had. So thank you very much. And, kind of leave it at that. But recognize that there will be structure to this. There may be multiple panelists. They may be sharing questions, share the questions out around them. So different people will come from different angles as you work this through. But recognize where you are in the interview and how you need to again capitalize on recency and primacy with all of that. Now, I'm looking at my clock. I want to just encourage you for 2 minutes just to think about your key takeaways from the last hour. I've thrown a lot of information at you. As I mentioned earlier, there's a real opportunity to ask questions in coming weeks on, or coming week on Slido, but I'm just going to get Slido open myself here and just pick that up. Okay, it's not, here it is. Just check whether we've got any questions while you just think about your key takeaways. So maybe something that you could start, continue, improve, consider, or even stop doing as a result of the session. Okay, great. We've got a load of questions. Good, okay. What I'm going to do then is just put that on the screen, and we'll deal with these questions in Slido. We can look at those in a moment or two, but I'm going to go to Rachel for a start. Thank you for being on the panel here with us today, Rachel. Just really wanted to ask whether you got any thoughts, comments to add as a potential panelist, or even questions that you might want to ask.
So thanks very much, Bob. I thought it was fantastic, and you know, I'm not facing any interviews that I know of coming up, but I've learned a huge amount just listening to that, and I think I'm going to be taking the recency and primacy into some of my presentations and rethinking some of what I do. And I guess when we conceived this session, what we were thinking about was potential applicants feeling that this was a really challenging and difficult interface, and how would they overcome that. But I think what's really come through for me is how much opportunity there is here. Actually, the interview panel can't scare you as much as they used to be able to. You don't have to go into the enormous room the size of a football pitch at the Wellcome Trust and try to work out who's talking to you at what point in the interview. And actually, this idea that the bits that you can prepare, the start and the end, might actually be the difference between successful and a not successful interview. I know you've got some questions, and I want to let the attendees ask. I just want to ask one thing, which I think is based in my kind of bias. So the trait answers versus the example answers. So I know that I give trait answers. Obviously, that's not what you're supposed to do. And I wonder if you think that there's a place for a kind of layer on top of your examples, which shows the way that you have used your experience to develop your approach. I feel like sometimes if I just give an example answer, I'm missing an opportunity to show some self-awareness and some self-development. I'd just be interested to hear your thoughts about that.
Yeah, I think it's really valid. I mean, we love people who are willing to learn. You know, people who think they've arrived are a nightmare. Let's be honest. So yeah, we should, that's a really good point. We should find in our answer set somewhere the opportunity to talk about how we're mature, grown, learnt from something. Now, to go back to the STAR model then, I might use that as my result. You know, I could go into, and as a result of that, I learned this. So that might be a little nuance that you could put into that model and express that learning as a result of that experience. So, because we learn from good and bad experiences, don't we? So it can be really helpful, maybe even to give an example of a situation where it didn't go so well, but had a great learning.
Yeah. And, you know, in review of clinical aspects of practice, I think that's really important. But you've also reminded me of the best piece of interview advice, which I think might be kind of towards a scientific interview, but maybe not, in that we're quite often in the position where we're pitching our idea of our, this is my science and I'm committed to it, and this is my big idea and this is the fantastic work behind it. And it's actually, I think, what funders and institutions are looking for are people who have the ability to be flexible, to change their ideas, to go not with their bias of what they think is going to happen, but actually what the science shows them. And I think sometimes in a kind of scientific interview, people can fall into that trap of feeling like they have to stick to their ideas and their argument because that shows strength.
Yeah.
But actually, there's a greater strength in a flexible and expansive approach, I guess.
Yeah. I wish our politicians could learn that lesson. The U-turn is frowned upon, and it's all opposition based, so nobody would agree with anyone else. But I think it's assertive if somebody convinces you of a better argument to concede to that argument. It's aggressive not to, actually, and that's what we maybe see in a lot of politics. So yeah, I agree. It shows a maturity, doesn't it? That actually I'm willing to be influenced by the results, the logic, the arguments, rather than a preference that I might have in any situation. Yeah, I think that shows a nice maturity. Yeah. Good. Okay. Thank you for that, Rachel. Shall I look at some of these questions we've got here, guys, on Slido? Can you all see them if you go to the Q&A piece? Yes, you can. So if you go to the Q&A piece in Slido, you can start to see some of these yourselves. So let's just work through them, I think. Number one, how best to show leadership potential in an interview when slightly more introverted personality? Yeah, okay, so leadership is a big topic. Leadership is a big topic that we could spend many hours on. But I think the thing for me to bear in mind is that you're not a leader unless you have followers. It's the first follower that transforms a lone nut into a leader. And if you think about that, well, how do I show my potential to be a good leader, then it's often in predictability and consistency of behavior and action, and being principled in my actions and behavior, because that's easy to follow. So for a silly example might be this, if I'm honest in situation A and B, you can predict in situation C I'll be honest because I've got that principle. But if in situation A I'm honest, in situation B I bent the rules, then you have no idea in situation C which way I'm going to tumble. So it makes me very difficult to follow and makes me a poor leader. So I guess what I'm saying here is that, you talk about having that potential when more introverted. You want to be authentically you. We want leaders who are authentically the individual and not airbrushed machines of some sort. And if you're slightly more introverted as a personality, then that's you. We don't get away from that. But you still can be principled and thought through and logical and calm and clear about what you do and say. And so I think you can still express that leadership potential in that. I just realized, guys, sorry, in answering that, I realized I missed question one. So we'll go back. But yeah, so I don't know, hopefully that helps a little bit. What should you do if you feel the interview is not going well or an interviewer does not seem impressed with your answers? Yeah. Well, don't cry. That's perhaps my first piece of advice. But now I always think at any point, especially in a presentation, if you catch yourself doing something that's unhelpful or not going well, just reset. It doesn't mean you have to carry on doing it that way. You can actually just stop and pause for a moment and just go, okay, now let's get this right. Let's work this in a calm, collected way. And I go back to the elephant versus mouse analogy, actually. You can deal with problems in a mouse-like way, kind of squeaky, kind of fast, jerky movements. Oh, I've lost my place, and that sort of panic. Or you can do it like an elephant. That would be, Okay, I've lost my place here. Let me just check where I am. Okay, pick my thread up and then, then carry on in a calm and collected way. So don't feel you can't reset at any point. You really can. And it's a consciousness thing. If you think that's not going well, then don't keep doing that. Do something different. Change what you do. Do the same thing, you get the same thing. Do something different, you open up the door for a different response. I think, yeah, that might be helpful. Next one, how do you suggest we best convey positivity and enthusiasm despite not being in the room? Yeah. Well, this is back to the Moravian study, isn't it? Lyric, song, dance. You need some element of body language and tonal qualities to express enthusiasm. You can have enthusiastic content. I suppose you can read a book and it's sort of enthusiastically written, but actually at a human level, it's going to be in the inflection, the volume, the pace. Now, here's the really important part of this, I think. Enthusiasm, positivity, passion, I would say, have a slight speed associated with them. There's a little bit more energy thrown at that emotion. If you're interpreting somebody who's enthusiastic, it tends to be a little bit louder, a little bit faster. Now, I think that is absolutely a valid thing to consciously do at any point during your presentation. All I would ward you against is doing it at the beginning, because I think at the beginning, you want to send a different message. You want to send a message that says, I'm confident. And that requires calmer, more elephant-like, more collected, more thought through body movements, posture, gesture, voice, etc. So yeah, work into the enthusiasm, build it up. Don't kind of scare everyone, or kind of go off too early with that. I think. How are we doing for time, guys? Are we still okay answering these? We're good.
I think if we do another 10 minutes or so, that should be okay, Bob.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Christian. Does recency and primacy effect apply to responding to individual questions as well as the interview as a whole? Okay, really insightful question, Luke. Because how long does the recency and primacy effect last? We know it lasts over 15 words. We tried that. But yeah, did you know what? The scientists are a bit divided on this. And I think my take on it from reading around this is it happens quite a lot of times. If you have a break, you kind of get a restart on that recency and primacy. If you sort of move to a presentation, I think you've got a restart on the recency and primacy piece in that particular aspect. If somebody else is doing a load of talking and it comes back to you, I think there's a sense in which you've got to start again on that recency and primacy idea. So it works big picture and small picture. But what I would say, it probably works big picture the most, in that your very first impressions, your very first opening sequence of the interview and your closing sequence, I think, are the big picture ones. And let's face it, they are the true recency and primacy of that event. They're the first things and the last things that are said. So, I think it does have an application more macro level, but definitely think on the larger level. Should we take advantage of the recency primacy effect and avoid placing our strongest points in the middle of storytelling when presenting? I'm going to say no, put them in the middle as well. That dip, we need to make that interesting. Had we got longer, we could talk about how do we elevate the retention and the stickiness of that dip in a presentation in the middle. But all I'm saying here, I think, really is make sure that you are getting key messaging over early and in the closing sequence again. So you want what's the key messages here? Am I communicating those well? And then I'm going to cover it in the middle. That idea of tell them what you're going to tell them what you told them is very old. I learned that on a presentation skills course decades ago, but I think it still has validity, particularly when you look at recency and primacy. Should we take advantage of recent primacy effect and avoid placing, I've read that one. I always struggle to think of a good question to ask in the panel. Surely those questions should have been asked during the pre-interview visit. Okay, yeah. If there's a pre-interview visit, you should be asking questions. I go back to, and I know Christian is a fan of this, just don't ask questions for the sake of it. You know, if you can't think of a good question, you know, it's not obvious that it's a great question, that's okay. Don't ask it just for the sake. But if you can identify something as you go into the interview, even if there's been, you know, something, a pre-visit type scenario, I still think we should do that. We should try and look for those questions and try and think that through. You know, to leave an impression, you only need one good one, don't you? And so, you know, you don't necessarily need a whole load. A menu of them gives you options, but be flexible on it maybe. An interview, I was asked how would I contribute to improve the quality of publications for the interview? How do I address this in a very polite way? I might come to you, Rachel, for this.
Yeah.
I don't know, yeah.
So yeah, I think this is, obviously you don't want to be saying anything that is too negative about the people that you're interviewing in front of, but you also want to be very clear about your ability to bring value to the organization. So, you know, I think you can use this type of question as a way to show that you've researched what their institute is all about and what they have produced. You don't want to be in the situation where you where you're saying, well, I don't really know what you guys have published. So, but you can also use, you know, it's a good opportunity to talk around the different metrics for quality of publications. So there isn't one way to measure the quality of a publication, and you might think about preparing yourself for this type of question by perhaps having an example of one of their publications which has been practice changing or informative to your research, and how that fits in. So I think this is one that is actually a really good question for this type of scientific interview to prepare around a little bit. And I would think of those as the kind of positive ways to deal with that question. Christian, I don't know if you want to add anything to that, or Bob.
No, I think that's spot on, Rachel. It's really about knowing what these guys are doing, and not, as you say, you're bad and you need me to improve the quality of your work. So it's really to add something and actually discuss more about how to measure quality. I think that's a very smart way out of this. But as Bob also said during his first few slides, it's really important to know the organization, whether this is a grant panel for a funding body, whether it's a job interview at the university, whatever it is, you need to know these details, and then it's easy to answer these questions, or easier.
Great, thank you, guys. That's helpful. Okay, just a few more here. So, what do you recommend about screen backgrounds that hide your room? I think better tidy up your room if you can. Maybe. I know this within Zoom there's a blur one, isn't there? You can make the background a bit blurry, but I have to say it tends to make the person a bit blurry around the edges, and I don't know, that it looks a bit odd, but you know, you could use it. I think manage what you can. You know, there's some simple rules here. If you can avoid having a window behind you, that's really helpful because it doesn't wash you out in terms of the camera image. But you don't have to create much of an environment. I mean, I have got kind of this like little YouTube studio thing going on here very deliberately for this type of thing and for workshops that we run. But you know, just think about it. Just think about what's in the background. Can you adjust that, alter it, make any change to it? If you can't, then yeah, I wouldn't put Bermuda in the background or whatever it might be, because I know there's some San Francisco Red Bridge or whatever it's called. You know, there are options within Zoom those have those sort of backgrounds. I think avoid novelty. Best to just if you can, create yourself a tiny little background. If not, yeah, maybe use the fuzzy focus thing that happens. How could you express that flexibility you were talking about in the interview? Yeah, a good point. I think for me, I like to think of this in terms of not being so linear. You know, if I think I'm going to be structured in a very linear way, if something changes, it really helps me. It doesn't help me to flex and to move around. So I rather think about it like being lily pads, if you like, you know, sort of, you've got these topics, and actually you've got all these different areas of topics, and you can jump from one lily pad to the other, and they don't have to be necessarily sequenced. Nobody is expecting them to be necessarily in a particular order, unless there's some, you know, genuine logical sequence that you want to go through. So yeah, I think just think in terms of areas of discussion, questioning, topic, and therefore be ready to jump from one area to another rather than thinking it as linear, which might trap you a little bit in terms of your structuring. I don't know, Rachel, you've got any other thoughts on that? I think we were talking about that at the beginning, right? That sort of flexibility.
Yeah. And I think just there's a tendency to think that when a panelist is maybe arguing with you about a scientific idea, that you have to kind of defend your position within the interview. And actually, I think, and we've probably said this, I think it shows more strength and maturity to actually be open to that challenge and say, that's a really interesting way of thinking about this problem, and it's actually not one that has occurred to me. So yeah, that's really useful. My gut feeling is that maybe if you tried that, you would get this. You know, you don't have to defend your position to the very end to show that you have the ability to change your mind and be persuaded is quite an important thing.
Yeah, great. We have three quick ones, I think. So the webinar is super helpful. Do you do similar for interviewing remotely? We could do, yes, that's always a possibility. It happens, we do that. Yes. Do you have any tactics for controlling an interview? How do you connect with and get the interviewer on side? Okay, yeah, I mean that's a topic in and of itself. You know, it's probably the topic of influencing actually, and there's a whole bunch of stuff that you could think about how you condition outcomes, how you bring outcomes to bear. And again, you know, unsurprisingly, it's lyric, song, and dance. It's about the content I'm choosing, which is really important. The words I'm choosing, and you know, there's lots of psychology in this. So for example, if somebody had a particular phrase for something and you were using a different one, that would be unhelpful in building rapport and minimizing difference. So I don't know, vendor versus supplier, or dwelling versus home, or something. You know, if your panel is using a particular word or phrase, I would use the same one. I wouldn't use the alternative one, because I want to minimize difference on all sorts of levels. Really, we could spend a whole day on this topic of how you have influence in a situation. Maybe that's another session, one future point, along with interviewing skills, guys. I'll leave that one there. Finally, any advice on acceptable weaknesses? Yeah, you don't have any. That'd be my advice. Again, you know, okay, we've got to be real, authentic again in all of that. But I wouldn't go into an interview highlighting my failures and my weaknesses particularly, unless I've got a good learning experience from it. It's that conditioning thing again. You know, if I start to talk about how badly I did something, I've got to be really careful with that message. You know, I think the caveat is I had a great learning, and the learning was this. But you know, you might be. We said it might be a genuine question that you get. You get asked, you know, what might be your strengths or your weaknesses. You may get asked that question. How would I answer that in that situation? I would probably find something to say that isn't particularly bad. If I was asked that question, I think is my honest answer to that. Good, thank you guys. Thank you for those questions. Again, that's open now for a week, that Q&A section. So if you want to add more questions, I will revisit it in a couple of days' time and see if I can answer any more questions. Right, I think I'm done. I'm going to hand back over to you, Christian, if that's okay.
Thanks very much. There's one other thing, obviously. So we got a few questions that were submitted before we started this. Now, it's quite a few. I went through them again, and I think we covered most of them. There were a few very specific questions about specific situations, like postdoctoral interviews, like remote PhD vivas. We know where these questions came from, and I think we will discuss with between the three of us and the Secretariat how to answer them and how to feed back to as many of you as possible. So these questions will be answered, but I think most of this has been covered today. I think just in the interest of time, we would have to come to an end because I know everybody is busy with other things. Maybe towards the end, I really apologize for this. I should have introduced, of course, Claire and Susan, who were in the background all the time from our Secretariat. And they did all the hard work with preparing for this, and they will have even harder work now to follow all of this up. Susan, do you want to say, or Claire maybe, just a quick word how we do the feedback and how we do the certificates that delegates participated at this meeting?
Thank you, Christian. Yes, just to say that at the end of the meeting, everybody will receive a very short 2-minute survey. We would be very grateful of your feedback. And if you would like to receive the CPD certificate, we have been accredited with 1 CPD point from the Royal College of Physicians, and I'll be glad to send you a certificate if you just include your email address.
So that's very helpful. Thanks, Claire, for doing this. I think it's time to stop. I'm thinking about something really strong now, Bob. I'm really worried because I obviously know that I need to finish very strongly. But I think you did such a great part in the middle of this webinar. So I think it doesn't depend on this occasion. So thank you very much to everybody for joining today and for helping us with this webinar. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.